Mara's back hit the brick wall before she even saw him coming. The air left her lungs in one sharp breath, and for a moment, all she could hear was the buzz of the diner's broken sign somewhere behind her. "You think you can keep dodging me?" Ray's voice was low, almost gentle. That was always the worst part. He sounded calm right before he hurt her. She pressed her palms flat against the cold brick, trying to find her footing. "I told you, I'll have the rest by Friday. You told me that last Friday. Ray, please. I worked 4 doubles this week. I just need a few more days." He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell cigarettes and the cheap aftershave he always wore. "A few more days. You know how many times I've heard that from you?" She didn't answer. There was no answer that helped. His hand came up, not to hit her, but to grip her jaw and tilt her face toward his, like he was inspecting something he owned. "You're lucky I like you, Mara. Most people who owed me this much, I wouldn't be this patient." "I know." "Do you?" Her legs were shaking. Not from cold, though the night was cold enough to see her breath. She tried to step sideways, toward the light of the parking lot, toward anywhere that wasn't this narrow gap between the dumpster and the wall, but his foot moved to block hers before she got anywhere. That was when he kicked her. It caught her low, in the side, and the pain folded her forward before she understood what had happened. She put a hand against the wall to keep from going down completely, and somewhere in her chest, underneath the pain, she felt something that was almost relief, because at least now she knew where tonight was going. The waiting was worse than the hurting. It always had been. "Please," she said, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. "Don't kick me. I'm already hurt." She didn't explain what she meant. She didn't have to. Ray knew the history as well as anyone, even if he never once asked about it, even if he used it like a tool instead of a warning. He raised his foot again. Headlights swept across the alley wall, throwing long shadows across the dumpsters. A car door opened, then closed, unhurried, the way a person closes a door when they have nowhere urgent to be and nothing to fear. Boots crossed the gravel at an even pace, not running, not rushing, just arriving, the way weather arrives, with no interest in whether you were ready for it. Ray turned, his foot still half raised, looking faintly ridiculous now that he had an audience. "This isn't your business," he said. The man who had stepped out of the car didn't answer right away. He was tall, dressed in a dark coat that looked too clean for a back alley, his hands loose at his sides. He glanced at Mara first, at the way she was holding her side, and something in his face changed for half a second, before it settled back into stillness. Then he looked at Ray. "Apologize to the lady." Ray laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Who do you think you are?" The man didn't raise his voice. He never seemed to need to. "Apologize to the lady," he said again. The exact same words, the exact same tone, like he was giving Ray a second chance he didn't deserve. Ray's laugh faded when he noticed that the man hadn't blinked, hadn't moved, hadn't done anything except stand there with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world and absolutely no interest in spending it arguing. "Look, man, this is between me and her." "Not anymore." Something about those 2 words made Ray take a step back. Mara, still bent over with one hand braced against the wall, watched the whole exchange with the strange, floating feeling of someone watching events that didn't quite belong to her anymore. She didn't see exactly what happened next. She was looking at her own hand instead, at the way her fingernail had split clean down the middle when she'd thrown her arm up to block the second kick, and for some reason that small, stupid detail was the only thing she could focus on. A split fingernail. Such a small thing to notice in the middle of everything else. When she looked up again, Ray was walking quickly toward the street, glancing back twice. The kind of glance a person gives when they are deciding whether running would be worse than staying. The man crouched down so he was level with her, not standing over her, not towering, just there, at her height, the way you might kneel next to someone who is hurt, instead of standing above them. "Can you stand?" he said. It wasn't really a question. It was an offer. She nodded, though her side throbbed with every breath, and let him help her up. His grip was steady, careful, the kind of careful that came from practice rather than nervousness. "I'm fine," she said automatically. "You didn't have to do that. Didn't do much. You scared him off. That's not much." She studied his face properly for the first time. She realized with a small jolt that she recognized him. Booth 6. The man who came in 4 nights a week, always alone, always ordered black coffee he barely touched, always left a tip too large for the bill. The waitresses had a dozen theories about him. None of them had agreed on what he actually did for a living, only that none of the regulars ever sat near booth 6 without being asked to move first. "You're from the diner," she said. "I am. I don't even know your name." "Dimitri." "Mara," she said, though she had a feeling he already knew that. He'd been tipping her for almost a year. People who left tips like his usually paid attention to small details. He looked at the way she was still holding her side. "You should sit down somewhere that isn't an alley. I have a shift to finish." "You don't." "I really do. I need the hours." "You don't," he said again, and something about the flatness of it told her this wasn't an argument she was going to win. Not because he was forcing her, but because he had already, somehow, decided the outcome before she'd opened her mouth. He walked her back through the side door of the diner, past the kitchen where Walt, the night manager, looked up from the grill, and then very deliberately looked back down, the way a person does when they have decided not to ask questions they don't want answered. Lucy, the other waitress on shift, caught Mara's eye from across the counter, eyebrows raised but said nothing either. Dimitri led her to booth 6, the one that was somehow always empty when he wanted it to be, and sat her down across from him. "I'm not a charity case," she said, mostly because someone needed to say something, and her ribs wouldn't let her stand up and walk away on principle the way she wanted to. "Didn't say you were. You don't even know what's going on." "I know enough. You don't." He didn't argue with her. He simply reached for the small laminated menu sitting between the napkin holder and the sugar, slid it toward her, and said, "Eat something." She didn't eat. She didn't eat. She sat there instead, hands wrapped around a glass of water she hadn't asked for, watching the steam rise off coffee neither of them touched, feeling the strange, hollow quiet that comes after fear has nowhere left to go. Dimitri didn't fill the silence. He let it sit there between them, unbothered, the way some people are uncomfortable with quiet, and others simply aren't. After a while he asked, "Where do you live?" It wasn't gentle, the way he asked it, but it wasn't cold either. It was the question of someone collecting information, not making conversation. "Doesn't matter," she said. "It does." "Why?" "Because the man who just put his foot in your side is going to come back tomorrow, asking for whatever he thinks you owe him, and I'd like to know where he's going to do that." She hesitated, then told him, mostly because she was too tired to keep dodging, the apartment above the laundromat. 3 months behind on rent that was never legally hers to owe in the first place, signed onto a lease in a kitchen that didn't exist anymore, under circumstances she didn't explain and he didn't ask her to. Dimitri didn't write any of it down. He didn't need to. He simply nodded once, like a man closing a file in his head, and said, "Go home tonight. Lock the door. Don't open it for him." "That's it? That's the advice? For tonight? And tomorrow?" He looked at her for a long moment, long enough that she felt the urge to look away first, and didn't. "Tomorrow," he said, "you won't have to worry about him." She wanted to ask what that meant. She wanted to ask 100 things, actually, starting with, "Who are you really?" and ending with, "Why does any of this matter to you?" But something about the stillness in his face told her that whatever answer he gave would only be the smallest, edited version of the truth, and that asking for more would get her nothing but silence. So instead she said, "Thank you," because it was true, even if it felt strange in her mouth, a word she hadn't used in a long time without something attached to it, some condition, some price. "Don't thank me yet," he said, which should have worried her more than it did. He left a $100 bill on the table for a cup of coffee neither of them had finished, told Walt on his way out that Mara was taking the rest of the night off, and walked out into the parking lot without looking back, the same unhurried pace he'd arrived with, like nothing about the last 20 minutes had cost him anything at all. Lucy slid into the booth across from her the second the door swung shut. "Okay, what was that?" "I don't know," Mara admitted, and for once it was the truth. She drove home with her ribs aching every time she turned the wheel, replaying the alley over and over, the kick, the headlights, the 2 words "apologize" to the lady that had made a grown man back away like a kicked dog. She kept circling back to the moment Dimitri had crouched down to her level instead of standing over her. Small thing. She wasn't sure why it stuck. When she got to her building, the lights in Ray's office above the laundromat were dark, which wasn't unusual for that hour, except for the fact that the front door, which had always stuck and needed a hard shoulder to open, swung open easily under her hand, like someone had already been through it that night and hadn't bothered to lock it back. She climbed the stairs slowly, holding the rail, listening for anything that didn't belong. The apartment was empty, untouched, exactly as she'd left it that morning, down to the mug still sitting in the sink. It wasn't until the next morning, when she went downstairs to ask the building's actual owner, a quiet older man named Glenn who normally only handled maintenance requests, about Ray's whereabouts, that she learned something had changed overnight, in a way she didn't understand and wasn't sure she wanted to. Ray doesn't manage this building anymore, Glenn told her, looking faintly confused himself, like a man repeating information he'd been given rather than information he understood. Paperwork changed hands last night. You're paid up through the end of next month, by the way. Whoever handled it left clear instructions. Mara stood in the lobby with her coffee going cold in her hand, staring at him, trying to make the sentence mean something other than what it obviously meant. Who handled it? Glenn shrugged. Wasn't given a name. She didn't need one, she already knew. What she didn't know yet, standing there in that lobby with her ribs still aching and her rent somehow paid, was that the quiet, unhurried man from booth 6 didn't do anything by accident, and that nothing he'd done the night before had been free. She just hadn't been told the price. Not yet. The diner felt different that night, though nothing about it had actually changed. Same chipped counter, same hum from the kitchen fridge, same cracked vinyl on the booth seats. Mara moved through her shift on autopilot, refilling coffee cups and wiping down tables, but every few minutes her eyes drifted toward booth 6 out of habit, half expecting to see him there. He didn't come in. Not that night, and not the next. By the third night, Lucy noticed the way Mara kept glancing at the door every time the bell above it rang. "You're waiting for him," Lucy said, not unkindly, sliding a stack of clean mugs onto the shelf. "I'm not waiting for anyone." "Mara, I just want to know what's going on, with the apartment, with Ray. None of it makes sense." "Some things don't have to make sense," Lucy said. "Some things you just say thank you for and move on." Mara wanted to believe that. She wanted, badly, to let the relief of an unlocked door and a paid rent stand on its own, without turning it over and over looking for the hook underneath. But she had learned a long time ago that the moments which looked like rescue rarely came without a cost attached somewhere down the line, even when the person offering didn't say so out loud. On the fourth night, the bell above the door rang at 1:45, and this time, when she looked up, he was there. Same dark coat, same unhurried walk. He didn't sit in booth 6 this time. He walked straight to the counter where she was working and sat on the stool across from her, close enough that she had to look up to meet his eyes. "You disappeared," she said, before she could stop herself. "Had things to handle." Things like rewriting a building's ownership overnight. Something close to amusement passed over his face, gone almost as quickly as it arrived. "Heard about that. Everyone in the building heard about that." "Good. Means it's settled. You can't just..." She stopped, frustrated, not sure how to finish a sentence that started with, "You can't just," when he very clearly had. You can't just walk into someone's life and fix it like that. People don't do that for no reason. "I didn't do it for no reason." "Then what's the reason?" He was quiet for a moment, studying her the way he had in the alley, like he was deciding how much of an answer she could handle. "Didn't like what I saw," he said finally. "Simple as that. Nothing about you seems simple. Maybe not, but that part is." She poured him a coffee he didn't ask for, mostly to give her hands something to do, and set it in front of him without comment. He wrapped both hands around the cup without drinking from it, the same way he always did, like the warmth mattered more than the coffee itself. "You don't have to keep doing things for me," she said quietly. "I can handle my own problems." "Could you? Last time I checked." It wasn't cruel the way he said it, but it landed somewhere tender anyway, because it was true, and she hated that it was true. "That's not fair." "No," he agreed. "It's not. Doesn't make it wrong." She didn't have an answer for that. She busied herself wiping down a section of counter that was already clean, and he let her have the silence, the same way he'd let her have it in booth 6 the first night, unbothered by the quiet, patient in a way that made her feel, for reasons she couldn't fully name, less alone than she had in a long time. Before he left that night, he set a small folded card on the counter beside his cup, a phone number, written by hand, nothing else. "For emergencies," he said. Not for thank you calls, for emergencies. She picked it up after he left, turning it over twice as if more information might appear on the back, and tucked it into her apron pocket without quite deciding whether she would ever use it. She told herself she wouldn't need to. She was wrong, though she had no way of knowing that yet, and 3 weeks later, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, with nothing unusual about the weather, or the schedule, or the way the diner smelled like burnt coffee and bleach the same as always, 2 men she had never seen before walked through the front door and sat down in booth 6 like they owned it, watching her work the floor with the kind of attention that had nothing to do with wanting lunch. She recognized something in the way they sat, the way their eyes tracked her across the room, that told her before either of them said a single word that Ray's name was about to come up again, and that whatever had been settled the night Dimitri walked into that alley had not, in fact, been finished at all. It had only just begun. "You're Mara, right?" the bigger one said, not bothering to look at a menu. He had a thick neck and a gold chain that caught the overhead light every time he moved. "Ray's girl." "I'm not anyone's girl," she said, keeping her voice level even though her pulse had already picked up. "What can I get you?" "We're not here to eat." The second man, thinner, with a scar through one eyebrow, leaned back against the booth like he had all afternoon to spend. "We're here about a debt. I don't owe anything. The lease got sorted out." "Not talking about the lease." The thick-necked one smiled, and it wasn't a friendly smile. "Talking about Ray. He's missing 3 weeks of payments to people who don't forget about missing payments. And word is, the night he disappeared, he was last seen getting his face rearranged by some guy in a black coat outside this exact diner." Mara's stomach dropped, though she kept her expression as flat as she could manage. "I don't know anything about that." "Sure you don't." The thin one tapped 2 fingers on the table, an idle, unhurried gesture that reminded her, uncomfortably, of someone else. "Here's the thing. Ray's gone, vanished, hasn't called his mother, hasn't shown up to collect from anyone, hasn't been seen by a single person in this town for 3 weeks, and the last place anyone saw him was right here, getting walked off by a stranger who apparently solved your housing problem the same night. That doesn't mean anything. It means everything." He smiled again, slower this time. "It means you know exactly who that stranger is, and we'd really like an introduction." Walt was watching from the kitchen window, his jaw tight, one hand resting near the old rotary phone mounted by the register, the one nobody had used in years except for emergencies. Lucy had gone very still behind the counter, pretending to count register receipts that didn't need counting. "I don't have a number for him," Mara said, which was almost true. She had a card. A card was not a number, not really, not in any way she planned to explain to these 2. "Then you'll find one," the thin man said, "because we'll be back, and next time we won't be so polite about asking." They left without ordering anything, the bell above the door ringing once, sharp and final, and Mara stood frozen behind the counter for a long moment before her hands started shaking enough that she had to set down the coffee pot before she dropped it. "You okay?" Lucy asked, coming around the counter. "I need a minute." She went to the back, past the walk-in cooler, and pulled the folded card out of her apron pocket where it had sat untouched for 3 weeks. Her fingers hovered over her phone for a long moment before she finally dialed the number, half expecting it to ring out, half expecting nothing at all. He answered on the second ring. "Mara. 2 men just came into the diner asking about you. They said Ray's missing. They said the last time anyone saw him was that night, with you." There was a pause on the line, brief, unreadable. "Stay where you are. Don't go anywhere alone tonight. They said they'd be back. They won't be. You don't know that." "I do," he said, and something in the certainty of it should have unsettled her more than it did, but instead it landed somewhere strange and quiet inside her chest, a feeling she didn't have a name for yet, something between fear and an odd, unwilling kind of trust. He arrived 20 minutes later, not alone this time. A second man waited by the car outside, broad-shouldered, watching the parking lot with the patient stillness of someone used to watching things. Dimitri came in alone, sat at the counter, and waited until her shift ended without saying much of anything, the same way he always seemed content to sit in silence rather than fill it. When her shift finally ended, he walked her to the car instead of letting her drive home alone, and the broad-shouldered man, introduced only as Leo, took the wheel while Dimitri sat in the back with her, the city lights sliding past the windows in long yellow streaks. "Ray isn't dead," he said eventually, without her asking, "if that's what's worrying you." "Is it? I don't deal in that, not for something this small." "Then where is he?" "Somewhere he can't bother you. That's all you need to know." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I'm giving you." She studied his profile in the passing light, the steady line of his jaw, the way his hands rested loosely on his knees, never fidgeting, never restless. "Those men said you and Ray have the same kind of friends, dangerous friends. Is that true?" "No," he said. "Ray borrowed from people who don't care whether you live or starve, as long as you pay on time. I'm not those people." "Then what are you?" He didn't answer for a long moment, long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. "Someone who decided you weren't going to keep getting hurt on my watch," he said finally. "That's the only part that matters tonight." It wasn't enough of an answer. She knew that. But something about the way he said it, flat and certain, without a single wasted word, made her stop pushing, at least for the moment, because pushing harder felt like it might break something fragile that she didn't fully understand yet and wasn't ready to lose. Lucy cornered her in the supply closet the next morning, arms crossed, the way she did whenever she had something to say that she didn't think Mara wanted to hear. "You're letting a stranger pay your rent and ride home with you in his car, and you still won't tell me what he actually does." "I don't fully know what he actually does." "That's not an answer. That's a warning sign with extra steps." Mara leaned against the shelf of napkins and ketchup bottles, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "I know how it looks." "Do you?" "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you traded one dangerous man for a different, quieter kind of dangerous man. And you're calling the second one safe, just because he hasn't hurt you yet." The words landed harder than Lucy probably meant them to, mostly because they weren't entirely wrong, and Mara had spent enough nights lying awake turning the same worry over in her own head to recognize it dressed up in someone else's voice. "He's not like Ray." "Maybe not, but you said that about Ray once too, the first month, before you understood what he actually was underneath the charm. That's different." "Is it?" Mara didn't have a clean answer, not one she was proud of, and the closest thing she could offer was the truth, plain and unflattering. "I don't know yet. I just know that for the first time in years, somebody looked at what was happening to me and decided it wasn't acceptable, instead of deciding it was none of their business. I don't know what to do with that. I'm not used to it." Lucy's expression softened, the irritation draining out of it into something closer to worry. "I just don't want you walking into something because you're grateful, instead of because it's actually good for you. Those aren't always the same thing." "I know they're not. Do you, though?" Mara didn't answer right away, because the honest answer was that she wasn't sure, not completely, and admitting that out loud felt like handing Lucy a worry she didn't need to carry on top of her own. What she did instead was tell her, in a flat, quiet voice she rarely used, about the year before Ray, about a different man with a different kind of cruelty, the one whose name she hadn't said out loud in 3 years, and didn't say now either, only that it had taught her to flinch at raised hands long before Ray ever raised one of his own, and that the words she'd used in that alley, the ones about already being hurt, had nothing to do with that single night, and everything to do with everything that came before it. Lucy didn't push for more. She simply pulled Mara into a hug, careful of the bruising still fading along her ribs, and said nothing at all for a long moment, which was, in its own way, exactly the right thing to say. The two men didn't come back to the diner the next night, or the night after that. By the end of the week, Lucy mentioned, almost in passing, that she'd heard from a regular that a man matching the thin one's description had been spotted leaving town in a hurry, his car packed with everything he owned, like he'd decided very suddenly that this wasn't a town worth staying in anymore. Mara didn't ask Dimitri about it. She had a feeling she already knew, and a bigger feeling that knowing the details wouldn't change anything, except how much she had to carry. What changed instead was the shape of her days. Dimitri started coming into the diner more often, not just for coffee, but to walk her to her car, to sit with her during the slow hours, to ask small, ordinary questions about her life that nobody had bothered asking in a long time, where she grew up, why she'd stayed in this town instead of leaving, what she would do if money and debt and fear weren't part of the equation at all. She found herself answering more honestly than she meant to. "I'd open my own place," she told him one slow Thursday night, wiping down the counter out of habit more than necessity. "Nothing fancy, just somewhere good, somewhere that smells like fresh bread instead of bleach. What's stopping you? Money. Mostly money, and the fact that I've spent the last 5 years just trying to stay even, not get ahead. That's not a small thing to admit. It's not a secret either. Everyone who works a job like this knows the math doesn't move forward. It just moves sideways, year after year, and you call that surviving because the alternative is admitting you're not. He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup slightly on its saucer, an idle motion that she was starting to recognize as the only outward sign he gave when something had actually affected him. What if the math changed? It doesn't change, not for people like me. It changed for the building, he said. Could change for other things too. I'm not asking you to fix my whole life, Dimitri. Didn't say you were asking. She didn't have a response for that. Not one that didn't feel like stepping somewhere she wasn't ready to step. So she let the silence hold the rest of what neither of them said out loud. A few nights later, she was wiping down the counter near closing when Dimitri's phone buzzed against the table, and though he usually let calls go to voicemail while he sat with her, this time he glanced at the screen and answered it without a word of explanation, standing and stepping a few feet away toward the window. She couldn't hear most of it, only fragments carried on the quiet of the empty diner. A name she didn't recognize yet, said twice, low and careful. The word asking, repeated. The word careful, said once, like an instruction to himself rather than to whoever was on the other end of the line. When he came back to the counter, his face had settled back into its usual stillness, but something in his shoulders sat differently than it had a few minutes earlier, a tightness he hadn't quite managed to smooth away. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Will be." That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got right now. He wrapped both hands around his cooling coffee, the same habit as always, though this time his thumb moved against the ceramic in a small, restless circle she hadn't seen from him before. "Someone's been asking questions about you, about us. I don't know yet how much it means." "Someone like who?" "Someone from a long time ago." He didn't elaborate further that night, and she didn't push, though the unease he'd carried in from that phone call seemed to settle into the corners of the diner and stay there long after he'd gone quiet again, a small, cold draft that wouldn't quite close. It was 2 weeks later, on a night that started ordinary in every way, that the second warning came, not from strangers in booth 6 this time, but from something far closer to home. She came back to her apartment after a closing shift to find the door unlocked, though she remembered locking it that morning, and a folded piece of paper sitting on her kitchen table that hadn't been there before, weighted down by a chipped coffee mug she recognized as her own. The note had no signature. It didn't need one. 3 words, written in block letters, plain and unhurried. "He'll know soon." She read it 4 times before the meaning settled into her chest, like a stone dropped into still water. Whoever had written it knew her apartment, knew her habits, knew enough about Dimitri to suggest, without saying outright, that whatever protection she'd been given had a cost attached after all, one that was coming due whether she was ready for it or not. She called the number on the card with hands that wouldn't quite stop shaking, and this time, when he picked up, she didn't bother easing into it. "Someone was in my apartment," she said. "They left a note. It said he'll know soon. I don't know what it means, but it scared me more than the 2 men in the diner did." There was a long silence on the other end, longer than any pause he'd given her before, and when he finally spoke, his voice had changed in a way she hadn't heard from him until now, something underneath the calm that sounded, for the first time, almost like worry. "Don't touch anything else in that apartment," he said. "I'm coming." "Dimitri, what does it mean?" "It means," he said, and she could hear movement on his end now, a door, footsteps, the sound of someone in motion. "Someone found out you matter to me. And that's a problem I should have seen coming." "Matter to you how?" He didn't answer the question, not directly. What he said instead, quiet and certain in a way that made her chest tighten with something she didn't fully understand, was simply, "Stay where you are. Don't open the door for anyone but me." She sat on the edge of her bed after the call ended, the folded note still sitting on the table where she'd left it. 3 words in plain block letters that had somehow managed to undo every fragile feeling of safety the last few weeks had built. And for the first time since the alley behind the diner, she found herself wondering whether the man who had walked into her life with such calm, unhurried certainty had brought safety with him at all, or whether he had simply brought a different, larger kind of danger, one she hadn't agreed to, and didn't yet understand the size of. Headlights swept across her window 20 minutes later, and this time, when she looked down at the street, there were 3 cars instead of 1, parked at angles that looked less like parking and more like positioning, and she realized, with a cold, sinking certainty, that whatever was coming for her had already arrived, and that the quiet, simple life she'd been trying so hard to hold on to had just run out of time to stay quiet at all. The cars didn't move. Mara stood at her window with the lights off, watching the 3 sets of headlights idle at angles across the street, engines running, doors closed, nobody stepping out. It felt less like a threat arriving, and more like a threat waiting, patient, in a way that made her skin crawl worse than shouting ever could have. Dimitri's car turned onto the street 8 minutes later, and the moment it did, the 3 parked cars peeled away in 3 different directions, smooth and unhurried, like nothing had happened at all. By the time he reached her door, the street outside was empty again, ordinary, as if she had imagined the whole thing. She hadn't. "They were here," she said, pulling the door open before he could knock. 3 cars. They just sat there. They left the second they saw you coming. Dimitri stepped inside and closed the door behind him, checking the latch twice, a small habitual motion that told her this wasn't the first time he'd checked a lock like that. "Show me the note." She handed it to him. He read it once, his jaw tightening in a way she hadn't seen from him before, and folded it back along its original creases with careful, deliberate fingers. "You know who sent it," she said. It wasn't a question. "I have an idea. Tell me." He was quiet for a long moment, weighing something, and when he finally spoke, his voice had a different texture to it, older, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "Name's Conrad. We grew up 2 streets apart, worked together a long time ago, before I understood what kind of person he was underneath the parts he showed me. And now? Now he wants what I have. Always has. The difference is, he used to be patient about it." "What changed?" "I did," Dimitri said simply. "I stopped being easy to push around. He doesn't like that I'm not the same person he remembers." She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the heat still running in her apartment. "So this is about you, not Ray, not me." "It's about you because you're close to me," he said. "That makes you a door he thinks he can walk through to get at me. That's the only reason any of this involves you at all. That's not exactly comforting. Wasn't trying to comfort you. Trying to be honest." She appreciated that more than she expected to, though it didn't make the fear in her chest sit any easier. "What happens now? Now you're not staying here alone. Not until this is settled. Dimitri, I have a job, a life. I can't just disappear into one of your buildings and wait for things to be settled. You can for a few days." "That's not—" "Mara." He said her name the way he'd said it that first night in the alley. Level, certain. The kind of certainty that didn't leave much room to argue with. "A few days, that's all I'm asking." She agreed, mostly because the alternative, sitting alone in an apartment that strangers could apparently enter and exit at will, felt worse than anything Dimitri's world might cost her. The place he took her to wasn't what she expected. She had pictured something cold and ostentatious, marble floors and bulletproof glass, the kind of house from movies about men like him. Instead, it was a modest brick house on a quiet street, the kind of place that looked like it belonged to a school teacher or a retired accountant, with a porch swing that creaked in the wind and a garden in the back that someone clearly tended by hand. "This is yours?" she asked, standing in the doorway, genuinely surprised. "Grew up 2 streets from here. Bought it back when I had money to spend on things that didn't matter to anyone but me." He set her bag down inside the door. "Nobody connects it to me. That's the point." Leo stayed posted outside in the car, and another man she hadn't met before, introduced only as Sam, took a position somewhere near the back gate, quiet and watchful in a way that made the house feel safer rather than more frightening, though she still found herself checking the windows every few minutes out of old habit. Dimitri didn't stay the night, not in any way she initially understood it, choosing the small guest room down the hall instead of anywhere closer, and the gesture struck her as oddly formal for a man who had already rearranged the ownership of an entire building on her behalf, without asking permission first. Over the next 2 days, she learned small pieces of him the way you learn a language, one word at a time, never all at once. He made coffee badly, far too strong, and didn't seem to notice or care. He read at the kitchen table every morning, the same worn paperback, though she never saw him turn more than a few pages in a sitting, like the reading mattered less than the quiet routine of it. He flinched, almost imperceptibly, whenever a car backfired on the street outside, though he covered it so quickly she almost convinced herself she'd imagined it. She found Leo on the back porch the first morning, cleaning a pair of sunglasses with the hem of his shirt, and sat down across from him without quite meaning to start a conversation, the way you sometimes sit down next to someone simply because the silence feels less heavy shared. "How long have you known him?" she asked. "Since we were kids. Different street than Dimitri and Conrad, but close enough." Leo set the sunglasses down, considering her for a moment, before deciding, apparently, that the question deserved a real answer. "He's the only one of us who got out clean. Built something instead of just taking it. Most people in our position, you ask them to choose between loyalty and getting smart. They pick wrong every time. He picked both. Doesn't sound like the kind of life that lets you stay clean for long." "No," Leo agreed, "it doesn't. But he tries harder than anyone I've ever met to keep the line where he wants it, even when it would be easier not to. That's worth something. Most days, it's worth a lot." "And Conrad? Where did he go wrong?" Leo's jaw tightened slightly. Conrad never had a line to begin with, just had appetite, dressed up nice enough that you didn't notice until it was too late. He picked the sunglasses back up, signaling, gently, that the conversation had reached its edge. "You should ask Dimitri about the rest. Not my story to tell." She didn't ask. Not that day, though the answer Leo had given her sat with her anyway, another small piece of the language she was slowly learning to read. On the second evening, sitting across from him at the small kitchen table, while Leo made a slow patrol of the block outside, she finally asked the question she'd been circling for days. "What did he do to you, Conrad, before all this?" Dimitri's hands stilled around his coffee cup. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer at all, and she was prepared to let the silence stand, the way she had learned to let his silences stand from the very first night. "Got someone hurt," he said finally. "Someone who mattered to me. Wasn't supposed to happen that way. He knew it would, and he let it happen anyway, because it was useful to him. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to." The flatness in his voice told her everything the missing details couldn't, and she understood, with sudden clarity, exactly why the man across from her had walked into an alley 3 weeks ago and ended a stranger's cruelty without a single second of hesitation. Some decisions, once made early enough in a life, simply never needed to be made twice. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Wasn't your fault to be sorry for. Doesn't mean I'm not." He looked at her then, really looked, in a way that made her feel seen in a manner she hadn't experienced in longer than she wanted to admit. And something passed between them that neither of them named out loud, though both of them clearly felt its weight settle into the room. That same night, unable to sleep, she found him sitting alone on the porch swing in the dark, the chain creaking softly under his weight, his coffee long gone cold beside him. "Can't sleep either," she said, settling onto the step near his feet rather than the swing itself, giving him the space she suspected he needed. "Used to this house being quiet in a different way," he admitted. "Easier when it was just mine to worry about. You don't have to take responsibility for all of it, Conrad, Ray, any of it. None of this started because of something you did wrong. Doesn't matter how it started," he said. "Matters what I do now that it's happening." He turned the cold cup slowly in his hands. "You asked me once what I am. Truth is, I've spent a long time deciding that for myself, piece by piece, choosing which parts of where I came from I was willing to keep, and which parts I wasn't. Conrad never did that. He just kept whatever was useful, no matter who it hurt. And you think choosing makes you different from him. I know it does. Doesn't mean it makes me safe to be around. Just means I get to decide what kind of danger I am, instead of letting it decide for me." She thought about that for a long time after she finally went up to bed, the words settling somewhere she couldn't easily shake them, and the next morning, walking to the corner store for milk while Leo trailed half a block behind in the car, she noticed a man on the opposite curb who didn't seem to be doing anything in particular, only standing, watching the street with the kind of patience that didn't belong to someone simply waiting for a bus. She told herself it was nothing. She told Leo about it anyway, almost as an afterthought, and Leo's expression didn't change, but he made a call the second she was back inside, low and quick, and didn't explain what was said. It was the following afternoon, while Dmitri was out handling something he didn't explain and Leo had stepped away to take a call, that Mara made the mistake that would change everything. She had grown restless inside the small brick house, tired of being protected, tired of waiting for danger to arrive instead of doing something useful with her hands. And when she remembered that her shift schedule still had her name on it for that evening, an old, stubborn part of her decided that one trip to the diner, quick and quiet, wouldn't hurt anything. She told herself she just wanted to check on Lucy. She told herself it was a small risk, an acceptable one, in a life that had been entirely too careful for entirely too long. She left a note of her own on the kitchen table, an apology she planned to deliver in person before anyone noticed she was gone, and walked the 6 blocks to the diner with her collar up against the wind, telling herself the whole way that nothing would happen in 6 familiar blocks in broad daylight. She was wrong. A car pulled alongside her 2 blocks from the diner, sleek and black, moving at exactly her walking pace, and before she understood what was happening, the rear door opened and a hand closed firmly around her wrist, pulling her off balance and into the open seat, with a speed that left no room for her to scream before the door shut again and the car pulled smoothly back into traffic, as unhurried and confident as if it had every right in the world to be there. The man sitting across from her in the back seat was older than Dmitri, silver at the temples, dressed in a suit that looked expensive in a way that tried too hard to prove it. He smiled at her the way a man smiles when he already knows he's won something. "Mara," he said, his voice smooth, almost warm. "I've heard a great deal about you. I'm Conrad. I believe you and I have a mutual friend who's about to learn a very important lesson. Let me out of this car." In time. He studied her with an unhurried, appraising look that made her skin crawl far worse than anything Ray had ever done to her. Dimitri's always had a weakness for people he thinks he can save. It's almost charming in its way. Predictable, though. Predictable is useful to a man like me. He'll know I'm gone within the hour. I'm counting on it. Conrad leaned back against the seat, perfectly relaxed, perfectly in control, while the car carried her further and further from the only street where anyone who cared about her would think to look. "What do you want from him?" "Everything," Conrad said simply, the smile never leaving his face. "And you, Mara, are going to be the reason he finally gives it to me." The car eventually stopped outside a warehouse on the edge of town, the kind of building that looked abandoned from the road, and probably wanted to, with boarded windows and a chain-link fence that had rusted into permanent stillness. 2 men walked her inside without touching her roughly, which somehow felt worse than if they had, because it told her this was all calculated, every step of it planned in advance by someone who didn't need force to get what he wanted. They put her in a small office at the back, more storage closet than office, with a folding chair and a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. Conrad didn't stay with her. He left her alone with her thoughts and the steady drip of a leaking pipe somewhere overhead, which she suspected was deliberate too, a way of letting fear do the work that threats didn't need to. She made herself breathe slowly, the way she'd learned to during her worst nights with Ray, counting backward from 20, focusing on what she could control instead of what she couldn't. She didn't have a phone. They'd taken it the moment she'd climbed into the car. She didn't have a weapon, didn't have an obvious exit, didn't have anything except 11 years of reading people across a diner counter and the stubborn refusal to fall apart in front of someone who wanted to watch her do it. She started paying attention instead. The man guarding her door was young, younger than she'd first thought, fidgeting with a phone he kept checking and rechecking, the nervous habit of someone newer to this than he wanted anyone to know. She filed that away. The pipe overhead dripped onto a stack of pallets, which meant water access somewhere close, which meant plumbing, which meant this building wasn't as abandoned or forgotten as it looked from the outside. When the young guard finally opened the door to bring her a bottle of water, she thanked him, gently, the same easy warmth she used on difficult customers who needed handling rather than confrontation, and asked his name. "Not supposed to talk to you," he muttered, though he didn't leave right away. "I'm not asking you to do anything. Just making conversation. Better than staring at a wall." He hesitated, then said, "Danny," before catching himself and looking faintly embarrassed about it. "Danny," she repeated, filing the name away like a small, useful coin. "How long have you worked for him, Conrad? Couple months? You don't seem like you enjoy it much." "It's a job. Most jobs don't end with kidnapping people," she said carefully, watching his face for the flicker of doubt she was hoping to find. It was there, Small but real. The look of a young man who had agreed to something simpler than this, and found himself standing guard over a frightened woman in a folding chair. He said you'd be fine. Said this is just business. Does it feel like just business to you? Danny didn't answer that. He closed the door instead, but she noticed, when he did, that his hand hesitated on the latch a half-second longer than it needed to, and she allowed herself the smallest flicker of hope that the seed she'd planted might grow into something useful before this was over. Conrad himself came to check on her an hour later, stepping into the small office with the same unhurried confidence he'd carried in the car, a folding chair of his own tucked under one arm, which he set down across from hers and sat in, like the two of them were simply having a conversation over coffee. "Comfortable?" he asked, not really expecting an answer. "What do you actually think happens here?" Mara said, surprising herself with how steady her voice came out. "You really believe he hands you the docs because you're holding a waitress in a warehouse?" "I believe he hands me whatever I ask for, because men like Dimitri have a very specific weakness, and that weakness is sitting right in front of me." Conrad studied her with the same appraising look from the car, though now there was something almost curious underneath it. "You don't seem frightened enough. That's interesting." "I've been frightened by better men than you." Something flickered across his face at that, gone before she could name it. "Ray," he said, and the casual way he said the name told her exactly how much research had gone into tonight, how long Conrad had been watching her life from a distance before any of this began. Small man, small debts. Dimitri handled him the way he handles everything, quietly, efficiently, and told himself it made him different from me. The truth is, we're not so different, you're Dimitri and I. We both decide who gets hurt to get what we want. The only difference is, he tells himself a better story about why. He's not like you. "Give it time," Conrad said, rising from the folding chair with the same unhurried calm he'd entered with. "Loyalty is expensive, Mara. Eventually he'll do the math on what you're costing him, and men like that, they always pay the cheaper price in the end." He left without waiting for a response, and the silence after the door closed felt heavier than it had before he arrived, though underneath the fear, Mara found something else taking root. A small, stubborn anger at the certainty in his voice. The assumption that everyone, eventually, became exactly as cold as he was. Outside the warehouse, in a part of the story Mara wasn't there to witness but would later piece together from the things people let slip, Dimitri had received Conrad's call exactly 40 minutes after she went missing. "I have something of yours," Conrad said, his voice as smooth as it had been in the car. "Lovely woman. Works at that diner you can't seem to stay away from." Dimitri's voice, when he answered, was quieter than Leo had ever heard it, which was somehow more unsettling than shouting would have been. "Where?" "Patience. We'll discuss terms first." "Where is she, Conrad?" "Safe, for now. Whether she stays that way depends entirely on how reasonable you're willing to be about the territory you've been sitting on for the last 6 years. I want the docks. I want the warehouses on Fuller Street. And I want you gone from anything east of the river by the end of the month. And if I say no, then I suppose we'll find out together what kind of man you really are, underneath all that careful restraint you're so proud of." The line went dead before Dimitri could answer, and Leo, watching from across the room, said he had never seen Dimitri's hands shake before that moment, not once, not in all the years he'd known him. What Dimitri did next, he did quietly, methodically, the same unhurried calm he brought to everything, though underneath it, Leo could see something close to panic, finally cracking through years of careful control. He didn't call the police. He didn't call for backup in any loud or obvious way. He started making calls instead to people who owed him favors, people who knew the city's quiet corners better than anyone with a badge ever could, asking the same simple question over and over. Which of Conrad's old properties still had working utilities? Which warehouses had been quietly purchased through shell companies over the last 2 years? Which buildings near the edge of town still had water running through pipes nobody officially maintained? It took 6 hours, 6 hours of phone calls and old favors, and a patience that cost him more than anyone watching him could have guessed, until a name finally surfaced, a property on the edge of town with an active water account, under a name that traced, after 3 more calls, back to a company Conrad had used before, years ago, back when the two of them still pretended to trust each other. Inside the warehouse, those same 6 hours moved far more slowly for Mara, marked only by the dripping pipe overhead and the occasional creak of footsteps passing the office door. She lost track of how many times she stood and sat again, how many times she rehearsed and discarded plans that all ended the same way, with her alone, in an unfamiliar building with no clear path to a door. She thought about the bakery she wanted to open, the smell of fresh bread she'd described to Dimitri only days earlier, and found, strangely, that holding on to that small, ordinary dream did more to steady her nerves than anything else she tried. Danny came back twice more, each time staying a little longer, asking small questions of his own this time instead of only answering hers. He told her, in pieces, about a younger sister back home he was sending money to, about how Conrad's offer had seemed easy when he'd taken it. Quick cash for quiet work, nothing about kidnapping anyone written into the version he'd agreed to. "This isn't who I wanted to be," he admitted quietly, somewhere around the 5th hour, more to himself than to her. "It doesn't have to be who you stay being," she said. "Tonight's not over yet." He didn't answer that, but he didn't argue with it either, and when he finally left the door unlatched on his next visit, his eyes meeting hers for just a moment longer than necessary, she understood that the seed she'd planted hours earlier had finally, quietly, taken root. By the time Dimitri arrived outside that warehouse, the sun had gone down completely, and the building sat dark except for a single light glowing faintly through a gap in the boarded windows. Inside, Mara had spent the last hour talking quietly to Danny every time he came near the door, small questions, small kindnesses, until the young man finally admitted, in a voice barely above a whisper, that he didn't like what he'd signed up for, that Conrad had told him this was about scaring someone, not actually hurting them, and that he wasn't sure anymore which version of the plan he was actually part of. "You could let me go," she said gently. "Nobody has to know it was you. Just look away for 30 seconds. He'd never let that go. Danny's voice dropped lower, uneasy. "He'd end my job. Worse than that, probably. And if this goes wrong tonight, whatever happens to me, you think he's going to protect you afterward? Men like that don't protect the people who saw too much. They protect themselves." She watched the words land, watched the doubt deepen into something closer to fear, and understood, with the same instinct that had kept her steady through years of difficult customers and worse men than Danny, that she had found the crack she needed. Somewhere past the office wall, she heard Conrad's voice again, sharper now, speaking into a phone instead of to her. "He's taking too long to answer. Move the timeline up. I want this finished tonight, one way or another." A pause. Then, colder. "I don't care what it costs. I want the docs signed over by morning." The words sent a fresh wave of cold through her chest, but underneath the fear, she noticed something else, the faint, unmistakable strain in Conrad's voice, the sound of a man whose plan was slipping faster than he wanted anyone to see. He hadn't agreed to anything yet, but he hadn't said no either, and outside, in the dark beyond the boarded windows, headlights were finally turning off the main road, slow and deliberate, the unmistakable, unhurried arrival of a man who had spent 6 hours being patient and had run out of patience to spend. Danny heard the cars before Mara did, 3 sets of tires crunching slowly across gravel outside, and his face went pale in the dim light of the bare bulb overhead. "That's him," he whispered. "That's Conrad's man, the one who runs security when things get serious." "Or it's mine," Mara said quietly, though she had no way of knowing for certain, only the stubborn hope she'd been holding on to for 6 hours in a folding chair. Voices rose somewhere near the front of the warehouse, low and controlled at first, then sharper, 2 sides talking past each other, the way people do right before talking stops being useful. Mara strained to make out words through the thin wall, and caught fragments only, enough to recognize the calm, level rhythm of a voice she'd come to know well over the last month, steady even now, even here, refusing to match the heat in whoever he was speaking to. "You don't get to walk in here and make demands," Conrad's voice carried clearly now, no longer smooth, edged with something tighter. "I have her. That changes the conversation entirely. You have a frightened woman in a building with a paper trail leading straight back to your name," Dimitri answered, and though his voice stayed even, there was a coldness underneath it that hadn't been there in the small brick house, hadn't been there across booth 6. A version of him Mara hadn't met yet. "You think I came here without insurance, Conrad? I've spent 6 hours making very sure that if anything happens to her tonight, the next people through that door wear badges, not favors. You wanted the docs. You're about to lose everything instead. You're bluffing. Call someone and find out. There was a long silence, the kind that stretches out and changes shape the longer it lasts. And in that silence, Danny finally moved, sliding the latch on the office door open with hands that shook only slightly, and pressed a single finger to his lips. Side door, he whispered, past the pallets, leads to the loading dock. Go now, while they're talking. Come with me, Mara whispered back. You don't have to be part of whatever happens next. He hesitated only a second before nodding, and the two of them slipped out together, moving low along the stacked pallets, past the dripping pipe she'd noticed hours earlier, toward a side door that groaned softly on rusted hinges, but opened all the same. Cool night air hit her face the moment she stepped outside, and for a moment she simply stood there, breathing it in, before Danny tugged her sleeve and pointed toward the tree line at the edge of the lot, away from the cars, away from the voices still rising and falling somewhere behind them. They didn't get far before headlights swung across the gravel, and for one terrible second Mara thought it was over, that someone had spotted them, until she recognized the shape of the car and the broad, familiar silhouette stepping out of the driver's seat. Leo, she breathed, relief flooding through her so fast it nearly buckled her knees. Get in, Leo said simply, already moving to open the back door. Both of you. From inside the moving car, through the rear window, Mara watched the warehouse shrink behind them, watched a second set of headlights pull in fast from the main road, 4 cars this time, lights flashing red and blue against the boarded windows, and understood, with a wave of relief so sudden it nearly brought tears she didn't have time for, exactly what Dmitri had spent those 6 hours arranging. Not violence, not a war fought building to building, something quieter and far more permanent. Enough evidence, enough quiet calls to enough patient, careful people, that Conrad's name was about to mean something very different to the people who had once respected it. Dmitri found her 20 minutes later at the small brick house, climbing out of his car with none of his usual unhurried calm, crossing the yard in long, fast strides that she had never once seen from him before. And when he reached her, he didn't say anything at all for a long moment, just pulled her into a hold that was careful around her ribs and not careful anywhere else, like a man finally allowing himself to feel something he'd been holding back for hours. I'm okay, she said into his shoulder, her voice steadier than she expected it to be. I'm okay, Dmitri. I know, he said, though his arms didn't loosen for a long while after that. Took me too long to get to you. Won't happen again. You came. That's what matters. He pulled back enough to look at her properly, his eyes moving over her face like he was checking for damage he hadn't been told about, and something in his expression, careful and unguarded all at once, made her chest tighten with a feeling she'd been avoiding naming for weeks. Conrad, he said, is done. Not in the way you might think, in the way that actually lasts. 3 different agencies are going to be very interested in his business for a long time. He won't be anyone's problem again. And Danny? Got himself a head start out of town and a number to call if he ever needs honest work instead of this. Seemed like a kid who made one bad decision, not 100. Figured he deserved better than what Conrad would have given him. She studied him for a long moment, this careful, unhurried man who solved problems with phone calls and patience, instead of the violence she'd half expected from someone in his world, who had spent 6 hours protecting her not through force, but through the quiet, methodical dismantling of someone else's power. You're not what I thought you were, she said, that first night. What did you think I was? Dangerous. I am dangerous, he said simply, just not to you, never to you. The weeks that followed moved differently than any weeks she could remember, slower somehow, gentler, the kind of ordinary that she had stopped believing she was allowed to have. She went back to the diner because she wanted to, not because she had to, and Walt gave her booth 6 without being asked, an unspoken understanding that had settled into the staff without anyone needing to say it out loud. Danny called the number Dmitri had given him exactly once, a week after that night, his voice steadier than it had been in the warehouse. He'd taken honest work at a garage 2 towns over, the kind of job that didn't ask him to guard anyone against their will, and when Mara picked up the phone and heard him say thank you, she found she meant it just as much when she said you're welcome back. Lucy never stopped watching the door for Dimitri's arrival with a healthy amount of suspicion, but the suspicion softened, week by week, into something closer to approval, especially after the afternoon Dmitri spent an hour helping Walt fix the diner's ancient walk-in cooler without being asked. his sleeves rolled up, grease on his hands, looking more at ease wrestling with a broken compressor than she had ever seen him look discussing anything involving warehouses or territory. "He's still strange," Lucy admitted one slow evening, watching him from across the counter. "But it's a good kind of strange, the kind that shows up." "That's all I ever really wanted," Mara said. "Someone who shows up." She thought, sometimes, about the version of herself who had pressed her palms against cold brick in that alley, certain that the night could only get worse, and found it strange how much distance had grown between that night and this one, not because the fear had vanished completely, old fear rarely did, but because she had finally stopped carrying it alone. Dimitri still came in 4 nights a week. He still ordered black coffee he barely touched, but now he sat with her during her breaks instead of alone, and Lucy had stopped pretending not to notice the way Mara smiled differently when the bell above the door rang, and it was him walking through it. One evening, months later, when the worst of it had settled into something closer to memory than fear, she found herself telling him about the small bakery she still dreamed about, the one that smelled like fresh bread instead of bleach, and instead of simply listening this time, he reached across the table, slow and certain, the way he did everything, and set a folded piece of paper down in front of her. It was a lease, a small storefront 2 streets from the diner, sitting empty for years, the kind of space that could become exactly what she'd described without ever once being asked if she wanted help finding it. "You didn't have to," she started, the same words she'd said to him the very first week, the conversation that had become its own quiet ritual between them. "Didn't say I had to," he answered, the same answer he always gave, except this time there was something warmer underneath it, something that had grown slowly over months of careful, patient company. "Wanted to." She looked down at the lease, then up at him, at the steady, unhurried calm that had once frightened her and now felt like the safest thing she'd ever known, and realized that somewhere between the alley behind the diner and this quiet evening in booth 6, the life she'd been simply surviving had finally, carefully, become a life she was building instead. "Thank you," she said, and this time the words didn't carry any of the old weight, any condition, any price waiting underneath them. "Don't thank me," he said, the corner of his mouth lifting into something that, on anyone else, might have been called a smile. "Just open early. I like my coffee strong." It took 4 months to turn the empty storefront into something worth opening, 4 months of sanded floors and second-hand ovens, and Lucy arguing loudly with a paint chart over what shade of yellow counted as cheerful instead of garish. Walt came by most weekends to help, claiming he only wanted to make sure the competition didn't put his diner out of business, though everyone could see the pride on his face every time another shelf went up. On opening morning, Mara stood behind a counter that smelled exactly the way she'd always imagined it would, warm and yeasty, nothing like bleach at all, and watched the first nervous customers trickle in before the sun had fully cleared the rooftops across the street. Dimitri arrived at 6, before the doors officially opened, the same unhurried walk, the same dark coat, and slid onto a stool at the counter like he'd been doing it his whole life, instead of only a year. "Strong," he reminded her, nodding at the espresso machine still gleaming with newness. "I remember," she said, already reaching for the right cup. He watched her work for a while, quiet in the way she'd come to understand as comfortable rather than distant, and when she finally set the coffee in front of him, he wrapped both hands around it the same way he always did, like the warmth mattered more than the drink itself. "You did this," he said, "all of it. I just signed a paper. You did more than that, and you know it." "Maybe," he allowed. "Doesn't change whose name is on the sign outside." She looked toward the front window, where her own name sat painted in careful gold letters above the door, and felt something settle into place that had been unsettled for longer than she could remember. A quiet, steady certainty that the life waiting for her on the other side of that glass belonged entirely to her, built with her own hands, chosen on her own terms, finally, after everything, exactly the way it was supposed to be.